Hi, it's Pastor Steve, and we are on January 6th of our Going Through the Bible, verse by verse. And today's passage is Genesis chapter 18 through chapter 21, verse 7. And our passage begins and ends with laughter. Now, in the very beginning of our passage, we have this very interesting encounter with the angel of the Lord visiting Abraham with two other visitors. Now, one has to pause and ask this question: what is the angel of the Lord? Somehow, when we look in the text, we see this is the divine presence, Yahweh, coming to meet with Abraham. Because Jesus is the incarnation, in other words, God with us, many think that this is a incarnation visitation of Jesus, in this case to Abraham. That's kind of a mysterious thing. We don't have a full answer on that. But one thing we know with confidence: God is speaking with Abraham. And in the course of God saying to Abraham, "You're going to have a son," Sarah is listening in the distance, and she laughs because she knows she's barren. She knows that it's impossible. And immediately the response is, why did Sarah laugh? Well, I would have to say it is something probably we all will do from time to time when we sense that God may have some big thing in store for us and we just don't think it's possible. But God knows what is possible. In fact, if God is in the equation, all things are indeed possible. As chapter 18 unfolds, though, what appears is a very dark story. God says to Abraham, "I'm going to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah." Now, this is disturbing to Abraham on multiple levels. One, his nephew, Lot, lives there with his family. And is God going to destroy his nephew? But Abraham asks a question of God, which I think is one of the most profound questions in the Bible. And it's found in verse 25. And he says that this: should not the judge of all the earth do what is right? In other words, Abraham is asking God, are you good? That's a very tough question. Very bold question to ask God. And what we find is God gives a very strong answer. He says, test me on this. What if there are 50 righteous people? Abraham says. What if there are 40? What if it goes down to 10? And eventually God allows Lot and his family to leave, even though they themselves are not the most righteous group of people, showing and answering Abraham's question with a resounding yes: I am indeed good. Now, this, because it is such a crucial question on the nature of who God is, it's an important passage, and that section needs to be pointed out. The next question, though, of course, is, what is the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, clearly, we see elements of homosexuality and really what amounts to rape, but it's also lack of hospitality. There's many things wrapped up in this. And so when you're trying to put your finger on exactly why God is destroying these two cities, we don't have a full answer. But what we know from what happens when the angelic visitors visit Lot is there's absolute evil taking place. Now, there's another thing that shows up when you look at this passage, which might have you scratching your head. What is Lot suggesting? Take my daughters instead. What common sense parent would say anything like that? And what you observe in this is another example of a narrative passage. It's telling us what happened. It's not saying it's right. It's just saying this is what Lot said. This is what Lot did. And so keep that in mind. Whenever you're looking at narrative, you're letting you're being privy to what took place, but it is not necessarily an endorsement. When you hear the words of God, that's when you're getting direct teaching and can appreciate that. Now, after Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed, you notice that Lot's wife turns around and she becomes a pillar of salt. This is one of the reasons why we think the location of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is kind of a mystery, is probably by the Dead Sea. And my first trip to Israel, we visited a mountain called Har Sidon, which is a mountain completely made of salt. And that was one of the speculative places of the possibility for Sodom and Gomorrah. Now comes a very bizarre passage. Lot's daughters are concerned that there's no men for them to marry. So they come up with a scheme to have sexual relations with their father so that they can conceive. Once again, you scratch your head and go, what? And yes, you did read that correct. Narrative passage, we're reading what happened. We are not having it endorsed. In fact, when Moses receives the law, he's going to specifically have a law about sleeping with your family members like that. But in this case, it's just letting us know what happened. Then comes a story which, if you remember, when Abraham went into Egypt, he pretended that Sarah, his wife, at that time she was called Sarai, was his sister, because she was very beautiful and she thought that Pharaoh would want to take her into his harem. And he was right. But the end result was Pharaoh smelled a rat because of God's privy of his dream, and he said, why did you do this? Well, you would think Abraham would have learned his lesson not to do that. But here it happens again with a guy named Abimelech. And he once again conveys that Sarah, who is an old woman, but apparently still a very beautiful woman, is his sister. And once again, the same scenario unfolds. Why? If anything, this tells us that people who are full of faith, good people, generally on the right direction, can still do very dumb things. And I think that's clear from this passage. But chapter 21, verse 1 to 7, the answer of God's prayer happens. Isaac is born. And why the name Isaac? Because the name means laughter. And Sarah says, God has brought laughter into my life. So our passage begins and ends with laughter relating to Sarah. Another incredible passage. I hope you're enjoying reading these foundational stories of our faith. God bless you.